Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Nashville Predators, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2. So that concludes the NHL's Stadium Series, where they played multiple games overseas. The San Jose Sharks faced off against the Predators in the Czech Republic for a couple of games, and the Sharks end up with a record of 0-2. So even though they've got two more games played than every other team in the NHL, besides, of course, Nashville, they still remain tied with them with a grand total of 0 points. On to how this game actually went. In the first period, things were not too bad for the San Jose Sharks. They managed to lock down what the Nashville Predators could do pretty majorly in that first 20-minute period, and even got a goal for themselves as Luke Kunin scored one on the power play to have the 1-0 lead after the first. But in the second period, things really broke down for them, and while they managed to get one goal in the second from Logan Couture to double up on their offensive performances from last night, or yesterday, I guess I should say, the Predators scored 3 goals to take a 3-2 lead, and that would be the final score. The third period would be controlled by the San Jose Sharks, but not enough grade A opportunities generated to actually be able to beat Predators backup goaltender Lankinen, even though they had about 2.5 minutes of 6-on-5 time to end this game off, and most of that was spent in the offensive zone. The Sharks really couldn't find much through the middle, and as such never got that game-tying goal. Moving on to the lineup, obviously David Quinn decided to change up a bit, though not really much. It seems as though he looked up at the lineup of what played yesterday and said, well, clearly the major problem here was Noah Gregor on that third line. Let's put in Evgeny Svechnikov and hope for a better result there. There were also a couple of other swaps. For instance, Lorentz moved from the fourth line to the second line, Lindblom down one line, and Svechnikov replaced Gregor, coming in onto the fourth line instead of that third line. But otherwise, there weren't really major changes to the lineup, so I'm not exactly sure why David Quinn was expecting that much of a different performance. But on to the first line, we had Meier, Hertl, and Kunin. Once again, a decent line for the San Jose Sharks, but Meier and Hertl, even though they were once again okay, they weren't necessarily world beaters here tonight, which is just not really going to be good enough for the San Jose Sharks if they want to win games. On the second line, we did have Kevin Labanc, and Labanc, very interesting player here tonight, because not only did he play a lot with this second line, joined by Couture and Lorentz, but he also double shifted many times on the first line with Hertl and Meier, which caused Labanc to end up with close to 21 minutes of ice time here tonight. Besides, certain overtime playoff games of that nature, I imagine this is probably one of the highest ice time marks that Labanc has reached in his entire career. Usually, even when he's on the first or second line, he will get some power play time, but he won't play in certain situations, like if the Sharks have a lead, because he's not that great defensively. And so it was very rare to see him actually cross into the 20-minute ice time, and yet he managed to do so here in Game 2 of the regular season because of this double shifting. And it wasn't double shifting because Kunin was necessarily injured. Kunin did end up playing a lot of those shifts on the second line with Couture and Lorentz, but mostly it was just Labanc filling in both roles. So clearly David Quinn really likes what Kevin Labanc is bringing to the table. Another player to talk about on the second line who benefited from the swap that Quinn did as Lorentz moved up from the fourth line to the second line. He was actually pretty decent, showed off a lot of speed, some actual solid offensive capabilities. Is he a potential future top 6 player for the San Jose Sharks this season? It is unlikely that is to be the case, but he is a player who theoretically, while Barabanov is injured, if that's something that's more so long term, he could technically fit into that role. Obviously, personally, I'd rather see a player like William Eklund do that, but I guess if that's not an option here for whatever reason, Lorentz is doing an okay job there. On the third line, we had Lindblom, Benito, and Nieto, and this was an improvement over yesterday's third line, definitely, but that's not really saying all that much. It's not as though this line was amazing or anything, but it was definitely better. Lindblom kind of awkwardly in a way finds himself maybe in the doghouse a bit with David Quinn already. He played less than 10 minutes yesterday, and then here today there was more ice time, but only about a dozen minutes there, and that's including some second power play ice time. And so generally it doesn't seem like Lindblom is really fitting into what David Quinn wants from this San Jose Sharks team. So even though this third line was improved, it definitely can be better. And on the fourth line, this was definitely a line that was a bit worse. Clearly was missing Lorentz's presence that they had yesterday. Sturm, Gadjevich as were joined by Evgeny Svechnikov, and even though Svechnikov had a pretty solid preseason, and of course Gadjevich, who's played both games on the fourth line, also had a pretty solid preseason, we see the big rift between preseason and regular season here. Neither of these two players really had any sort of impact on this game, and it was once again a pretty muted Sharks fourth line, which we are of course used to over these past few years. When it comes to the defensive side of things, I do actually want to talk a bit more about the defense structurally for the San Jose Sharks, because yesterday I of course talked about them a decent bit, how there's not really much offense coming from the back end, but I did mention that the Sharks played a decent game structurally defensively, and it didn't look too bad, and they mostly gave up the goals yesterday on the rush. The goals 2 and 3 were both on the rush. Here today it was a sort of the same, but also a bit different. I mentioned in the first period that the Sharks did a very good job defending, and this is because this is the part of the game that you can really draw up. David Quinn can tell, okay, you need to be in this position, you need to be in that position, you need to be in that position for when these types of situations happen. And so this type of system can even make certain defensemen that maybe aren't as good still look pretty solid. So of course, coming into this season, I talked about how besides Carlson and Ferraro, the Sharks have a bunch of 6th and 7th defensemen who are forced to play actual big minutes. You can kind of cover that up with a strong system, but the issue happens when that system does break down, when there are mistakes like turnovers at the blue line or in the neutral zone or even just in the defensive zone. These defensemen are suddenly forced to fend for themselves. There isn't that system to fall back on that they can just sort of stay in their position and do what they need to do. They need to try and be ahead of the play that is going to be forming on the offensive side by the other team. And this is where you need that defensive awareness. And besides Ferraro and Carlson, past them in the lineup, none of these defensemen are able to actually do that. And we saw that on each and every single one of these Nashville Predators goals. When things broke down in the defensive zone for the San Jose Sharks, they ran around like headless chickens. In particular, Matt Benning obviously stood out in a very negative way. We saw him on the third goal just getting pulled in each direction. Instead of being one step ahead of the play, he was 3 steps behind it. Megna, who actually I thought had a pretty decent season last year, looked completely lost on a couple of these goals. Shemek was wildly out of position as well, and just generally it was a pretty bad set of shifts for this defensive group. So even though on many of the shifts that they did play 40 minutes through this game, they played solidly sound defensive hockey, when things broke down and you need to rely on your actual skill set, it was pretty clear that many of these Sharks defensemen do not actually have that going for them, and so they gave up those 3 goals. Another thing that I do want to mention here on the defensive side of things is talking about Erik Carlson as well. He is a player through these first couple of games, has set up a couple of decent offensive plays, but I felt as though he has been kind of tamed a bit, and not necessarily because I feel as though Carlson is playing poorly, but it seems as though he's playing less aggressively as well, which was always a sort of give and take type of situation. Obviously, when he was playing aggressively, he could set up more strong offensive plays, but he would also be susceptible to more defensive errors. And I wonder if David Quinn actually sort of had a conversation with Erik Carlson to, telling him that now that he is the guy in San Jose to look to towards defensively because of the departure of Brent Burns during this past offseason, that he needs to play much more of a solid game and isn't able to take these many risks, also potentially because of his age and just how his game has kind of fallen off a bit since his prime, where he could do these types of things in Ottawa multiple years ago. And so while Carlson still clearly has the skill and the capability to pull off amazing offensive wonders in the offensive zone, it feels as though he isn't necessarily pushing the limit as much here for the San Jose Sharks, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because since the Sharks are struggling so heavily on the offensive side of things, if Erik Carlson isn't going to be the one defenseman stepping up to make these plays happen, they're just not going to happen. And then finally, we have the goaltending for the San Jose Sharks here today. It was Kakinen. Obviously, no surprise here that the Sharks' two goaltenders would be splitting the back-to-back. James Reimer played Game 1, Kakinen played Game 2. And I would say neither of these goaltenders necessarily asserted themselves as possibly being the starter for the upcoming next game in a few days. Kakinen was okay here tonight. He didn't have that many chances on some of these goals. Kind of similar to Reimer, though maybe you would have liked to see that one extra save there. But it was an okay game. Nothing amazing there. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. Obviously, they will have multiple days off since they have to make the trip all the way back to San Jose. And they will take on the Carolina Hurricanes. Going to be a big reunion day as Steven Lorentz will return to Carolina. Going to be very huge. I wonder if they'll have a video tribute for him. And then, of course, Brent Burns is also going to be coming back to San Jose, but I doubt there's going to be a video tribute there. What has Brent Burns really done for the San Jose Sharks? So, going to be an exciting one to watch. Class dismissed.